Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Are we good with video as well? Yes, excellent. Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're starting a few minutes late, but I don't think that is a problem whatsoever. We're so happy and exhilarated to have our esteemed audience, both face-to-face and virtually. Of course, we're now in the new normal, so doing things virtually is just how things go. My name is Emran El-Badawi. I serve as chair of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Houston. On behalf of the Banyuk Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance at Rice University and the Department of Modern and Classical Languages at the University of Houston, I welcome you to the first of 4 summits examining hate speech as a global crisis. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, please allow me to briefly familiarize you with this urgent project and unique opportunity. Today, the power of speech reverberates over expanding networks of media, government, and culture. Its power has been harnessed by both good as well as evil. Hate speech is an insidious part of cyberspace, political discourse, and discriminatory policies and practices. It is deadly, and when mobilized on a large scale, has led to genocide, and is today weaponized for cyber warfare. It is little surprise that these alarming realities became the subject of the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech in 2019. This project, set in motion by today's inaugural proceedings, is a cutting-edge international study on the most urgent hate speech challenges facing the world today. It is comprised of 3 parts. 1, media contributions by experts educating the public on global hate speech awareness. 2, 4 hybrid summits addressing hate speech, beginning with this one today. And 3, a book publishing the proceedings and findings to be utilized as a resource for policymakers, researchers, and informed public audiences. This project would not be possible without the generous support, long-standing leadership, and vision of the Banyuk Charitable Foundation. And the audience today is none other than Dr. Milton Banyuk and Mrs. Lori Banyuk. Their philanthropy has nurtured so many causes, including interfaith dialogue, publishing, and education programs at every level. They have supported many institutions, not least of which is the Holocaust Museum of Houston, Rice University, University of Houston, and many others. And they have touched so many lives. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in offering heartfelt gratitude and appreciation to our sponsors. In the audience as well as Mr. Jim Tyler, whose guidance and steady hand brought this project to fruition. He served as liaison between the foundation on one hand and its researchers on the other. Please join me in thanking him as well. Thanks are owed to Rice University's faculty hosting us today, namely Professor Elaine Eklund, the current director of the Banyuk Institute, Professor Paula Sanders, the former director of the Banyuk Institute and professor of history, and Professor Moshe Vardi, who is university professor and with us today. Please join me in thanking them. Forgive me, I have a lot to say. At this time, I welcome my fellow co-moderator, Professor Paula Sanders, to come and join me. And I now turn to introducing our distinguished panel. So again, take a deep breath. I will introduce our panel one by one. Maybe we can hold our applause until the end. Let's see how it goes. Amy Frake is Associate Director of Education, Holocaust Museum Houston. Her work includes educating the public on the Holocaust and human rights. This includes presentations at K-12 schools all across Houston and directing tours at the HMH. I have had the pleasure of being her student as a humble advisory board member on the HMH. I attended one of her tours, and we're grateful to have her. So, come on. I knew it would be like a basketball game a week. Next, we have Irene Guenther, who is an instructional associate professor at the Honors College at the University of Houston. specializing in 20th century American and European history. She received her doctorate from the University of Texas in 2001. Her teaching interests include genocide and human rights, the construction of, quote, race, unquote, and the consequences of systemic racism in the United States, Nazi cultural policies, and the comparative Second World War home fronts. She's published on the Nazi takeover of the German Jewish fashion industry, the contested politics of women's clothing in the 4 occupied zones of Germany after World War II, magical realism from 1920s Germany to 1940s Latin America, and the anti-war artists of the First World War. Her books include, I'm going to summarize because it's fascinating, Nazi chic, things right, question mark, fashioning women in the Third Reich, which won the Costume Society of America's Melia Davenport Publication Award for Best Fashion History Book of the Year and the Sierra Prize, given by the Western Association of Women Historians. Her second book, Postcards from the Trenches, a German soldier's testimony of the Great War, was published in 2018 and was accompanied by a centennial exhibition of World War I soldiers' art. Among many, many other honors and publications, please welcome Professor Gunther. Last and not least, because we see his presence before us, of course, it's not Big Brother, I promise, right? We have, Professor Gunther Jikeli is Erna B. Rosenfeld Professor at the Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism at the Born's Jewish Studies program. He's also Associate Professor in Germanic Studies and Jewish Studies at Indiana University. He received his doctorate from the Center for Research on Antisemitism at Technical University Berlin in 2011. He is a historian and sociologist of modern Europe with particular interest in the history of anti-Semitism and in critical anti-Semitism studies. His latest book, The Return of Religious Anti-Semitism, which is an edited volume, was published in 2021. In 2019, he published with Olaf Glockner, Das neue Unbehagen, Antisemitismus in Deutschland heute, the new unease, anti-Semitism in Germany today. In 2015, he published the monograph European Muslim Anti-Semitism with IU Press. In 2013, he was awarded the Raoul Wallenberg Prize in Human Rights and Holocaust Studies. Gunther's academic work was recognized in 2019 by the Allgemeine as one of the top 100 peoples positively influencing Jewish life. Again, among many other publications honors, please welcome Professor Jikeli. All right, very good. Almost done. So a couple of quick announcements as we proceed. Just one, of course, we're starting a little bit late, so rather than promise you a time and violate it for sure, I will say that we will we'll have our discussion with the panel. Paul and I will direct the discussion for an hour, and then we'll turn to Q&A for about 30 minutes with the audience. This is a hybrid session, so questions will be gathered by note card. Anusha, you're here, give us away. Okay, fantastic. They will be gathered by note card and, of course, over Zoom as well. There is a reception to follow in the hallway afterwards. It's kosher, halal, and delicious. I know that I have to add delicious, everyone. Okay, so no promise. And parking validation is available. Make sure that when you do get it, that you know how to use it. Okay, shall we begin?
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Thank you, Emran. Emran and I are going to pose some questions that we developed with our panelists, really spontaneous. And then we will do a sort of round robin among the panelists before we move on to the second question of perhaps about 5 minutes, 5-6 minutes each, as best you can. The framing for this event is somewhat colored by media coverage, which is not necessarily the most reliable metric. Some forms of anti-Semitic hate speech never went away. The underlying tropes never disappeared. But do recent waves, especially over social media, represent a new phenomenon or more of the same? For example, when we consider hate speech after the new management of Twitter, Kanye West, presidential politics, the current midterm elections. So I'd like to begin by asking Amy Frake to begin the round robin of discussion.
Well, I think first of all, this question, sometimes asking questions about historical patterns can be difficult to answer because usually we're only going to recognize them later. So there's a chance that what I'm about to say, a historian in 50 years will tell me that I'm very wrong. But I think the best advice I ever got when thinking about how to recognize anti-Semitism, because a big issue with particularly anti-Semitism, but other types of hate speech as well, becomes this issue of, well, how do we actually recognize it? And the advice I got was if you're seeing the same old tropes, no matter how they are no matter how they're being presented, then you're seeing anti-Semitism. So to me, I'm continuing to see the same tropes I'm used to, just they've been dressed up in particularly different ways. But to me, it does seem like it's pretty similar to what we've seen before. The difference that I've seen is how mainstream is what we're seeing and who is the person or people who are actually discussing it. So what ends up looking like waves is because it becomes more mainstream or it's being done by someone very prominent. So you see the example in the United Kingdom where with Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, where there's a big rise of concern about anti-Semitism because it's being said by so many people who are seen as prominent and important. And so now you have people like Kanye West who are saying these things. He has so many followers and so many people who are willing to listen to what he says. And so it makes it look like there's some kind of new wave and that it's different. But I think if you ask the people who are impacted by anti-Semitism, what I'll usually hear is, it never went away. It's always been here. I've been dealing with this for years. Just now, more people outside of my specific circle are finally paying attention.
I would say the tropes are the same, but that it's just exponentially growing, not just because of algorithms that we've learned about in terms of social media platforms, where very quickly, even if you comment in dissent against some form of hate comment, that too then will get a broadcast, and so before you know it, anti-Semitic comments get more and more and more and more viewers and comments and so on. But it also seems to me that leaders are supposed to lead. That's what we look for. So I agree with you in that aspect, that our leaders are, whether they're celebrity or political, they're even religious leaders, depending on what church we're talking about, are also, I think, playing an enormous role in expanding anti-Semitism. But, you know, I read not too long ago that I think it was the Oxford Digital Research Group in a consortium with the European Union found that in 2019, an anti-Semitic comment was published online every 83 seconds. And they expect that that probably has doubled by 2022. So social media seems to me clearly plays a role. Now, exponentially larger the problem's gotten, as well as how it's reaching people that it might never have reached before.
And Professor Jikeli.
Yes, well, first of all, apologies that I'm not with you in person. I would love to be at Rice University in Houston, but hopefully I can get there another time. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and honor to participate in this summit. On the hate speech, we have seen, of course, in recent discussions, I think since 2017, there has been more public awareness of hate speech online and that this might be a problem. And there have been attempts to think about it, what can be done about it. But of course, you're right that we see the same tropes, often very old tropes from 2000 years ago that can be reused, reformulated. We see that even those who use the internet or social media to disseminate their ideology and then use violence to even spread more of this message. So what we see that online and offline very often goes together, but often in a bit complicated ways. But all recent anti-Semitic terrorists have also used the social media platforms in some ways. First of all, they were not only radicalized relatively quickly, most of them online, but also they use this as a tool to disseminate that more often, and potential perpetrators learn from that and get encouraged by that. So new technologies I'm an historian, so I look back also in the history. So when the radio came up, that was also used to disseminate widespread. So Nazis were really doing a lot of the propaganda on the radio, and of course TV was also another step that was misused. But social media works differently, though. I think there's a qualitative different dimension to it, that it goes in two ways. So it's not only disseminators have a larger platform, but it can go in both ways, and they can radicalize each other. So we see that in certain bubbles, there is very quickly a norm of anti-Semitism can be established. We've seen that in our research on Telegram, for example, that we have certain channels where there is absolutely no dissent to an anti-Semitic discourse. And I remember, it's been 4 years now, when the terrorist of the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 Jews in a synagogue, and he was active on Gap. That's a similar platform, works similarly to Twitter, but is used almost exclusively by white nationalists. And he went on to even announce what he was doing. And I went there a couple of days later to see what the discussions on Gap are about this incident. So there was some praising the terrorist, and others were denouncing him, but saying he only killed elderly Jews. So that's how radicalized some of these groups are, or some of these channels. So I think there's a qualitative difference that we see in some of these movements, where we can really see it's quickly a norm of, however you want to call it. Hate speech is, I think, often too generalized, but on anti-Semitic ideas, anti-Semitic ways of thinking, this can really be established quickly in some of these bubbles.
Okay, thank you so much. There's so many points, of course, raised about the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, violence, radicalization, which we might circle back to, or we might sort of meet also in the next further rounds of questioning. So the next question actually was supposed to be the first question, until I realized, of course, that framing this discussion we have today as the return of anti-Semitism was something we needed to address first. And then, of course, with Kanye and Twitter, it just, there are things changing all the time. We had to change our sequence also of discussion. But I go back to this, what I feel is our basic question: how do you define hate speech? And how do you define anti-Semitism? And how do you see the two as being connected? So maybe Professor Gunther, would you like to start?
I don't think we should call it hate speech anymore, because now it's more than speech. It's also memes and GIFs and emojis and so hate communication might be better, although I don't think that sounds as, it doesn't trip off your tongue like hate speech, but it's targeted towards individuals or groups, and it's almost always fueled by ideologies of race, gender, ethnicity, what am I leaving out? And And the idea, of course, is to demean and demoralize, but also perhaps to make that individual or group feel very insecure and fearful about who they are and what they are. And of course, it combines with anti-Semitism, which is very specific to Jews, in that hate speech, it seems to me, foments hatred and violence against groups. And because anti-Semitism has been around for so long, I would argue that it's very easy then for that to fall into anti-Semitic hate speech rather than sort of hate speech more generally. You know, it might have been religious at one point, and then it became, you know, that they're nationally unreliable, and then that they're socially unreliable, and then they're politically unreliable because supposedly they're all communists or socialists. But the point is, beginning in the 19th century, especially with racialized anti-Semitism, it's just become pervasive, it seems to me. And so anytime we allow hate speech to occur, it doesn't just damage the community that's targeted. Overwhelmingly, it'll spill over into those very vulnerable communities that have been targeted in the past. So in that sense, I think this is really important to talk about. It's an important connection between the two.
So I definitely agree with that. I like the idea of hate communication, even though you're right, it doesn't seem to flow in quite the same way. But it does, we need to be thinking about the new ways that people are communicating and the way that the memification of some of these things. It's been very interesting to watch. I mainly work with K through 12 students, and so thinking about the way that people communicate and the way that so much hate speech has become a joke. And so it can be very interesting to look at when you're talking with students or looking at what they're interacting with online or what I'm interacting with online. I'm often seeing, oh, well, it's just a joke. And so it becomes this problem of how do you identify when someone is supposedly serious or when it is supposedly a joke. And that becomes very difficult for defining this and for even identifying it. But because I work mainly with K through 12 students, I often don't have time to go into some of the complexities of some of these issues. And so unfortunately, I do end up having to simplify some of what we talk about. If I have 45 minutes to talk about the Holocaust, I don't have a lot of time to define anti-Semitism. So often it ends up being relatively simple. Anti-Semitism, for example, is the hatred of Jews. But there's so much more that goes into it. But I think with hate speech in general, something we talk about a lot is the idea of dehumanization. Because that idea of dehumanization gets to the way that a group is being thought about, but also that idea of wanting them to feel fear. Hate speech is saying these things, wanting people to think these things, but also wanting the group that's targeted to feel unsafe, to feel not good. I had a student who once talked about he was Jewish, but he said, well, he talked about race and these issues with friends, and they said, well, you're white, you can't understand this. And he said, well, I can pass, but I'm Jewish, and when people find out that I'm Jewish, they'll treat me differently, they'll say different things to me. And that idea of fear, I think, for him was very pervasive. And he talked about how he saw being white, for example, as feeling a little bit more safe, and that's something he said he often didn't feel. So hate speech really getting into how you're talking about it to other people, but how you want that group to feel, I think is a really important part of thinking about hate speech and then anti-Semitism specifically.
Yeah, if I may jump in. Yeah. Well, hate speech. So yeah, I heard this is a term that maybe is not not clear enough, and it's a loose concept. There is no, at least I'm not aware of, a clear definition what actually hate speech is. But we have seen portraying groups of people in a very negative way can lead to genocide. And that is not only in the case of anti-Semitism. So we have seen some of it, and maybe we need a clearer definition what we actually mean then by that, and when do we say what stereotyping is harmful, and to what extent. But I would like to stress one thing that I've seen over and over again in discussing anti-Semitism. I think what's often misunderstood is, yes, this is targeting Jews, but it's also a way of thinking that is harmful to the society at large. It's really a conspiratorial way of thinking, where we want to blame one group of people and not go into problem solving, but just blaming the idea that there's a cabal running the world. This is a very powerful way of thinking. And I think there is a dynamic there that can develop, and that can develop very quickly. That is maybe also possible, and we've seen that to some extent also in other forms of hate. But this is something very specific, this idea that the cabal is running and there's also this fear of Jews in there. And we can see that that this runs deep also on social media, and these explanations how people think about COVID, or how people think about migration, or how people think about even human rights. And it's so powerful because it can be used by people of all kinds of political backgrounds, and they just frame it a bit differently. But it's kind of the attempt to say, why is the world not as we wish the world should be? And then Jews are blamed. Is it the migration that some people think there's too many immigrants in the country? This is then the great replacement theory, blaming this on Jews, that they organized that. Or why is the world not a peaceful place? Then maybe Israel is blamed for all conflicts in the world. So these kind of things that you can see, we can see that in on social media. And what I think Professor Gunther mentioned earlier, some 5 years back, there was every 83 seconds an anti-Semitic post. I mean, in our research that we just published, on Twitter only, and only on conversations about Jews, that's every 20 seconds. On conversations about Israel, it's every 5 seconds. So this is accelerating the pace of it that we can see.
I think this next set of questions follows very directly on what we've just been discussing. Is there any connection between anti-Semitic hate speech on the one hand and hate crimes on the other? In other words, is there, or what is the connection between words and violence? And if you could, in answering, perhaps mention some specific examples. And let's begin this time with Professor Jikeli.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I thought about this question. It's a complicated one. In social psychology, this has been a topic of research for decades. Eichen and Fishbein, I think, were the ones who worked on this most extensively. And it's not a straight relationship, because a lot of people have anti-Semitic ideas in their heads, or hatred against some groups in their heads, but they don't act on this. So in order to act on this, because I think most people, thankfully, have some kind of civility, have learned some civility, how to interact with other people. And in order to act aggressively against a group of people, there's certain steps have to happen. So, but what definitely is helps those who have this hatred in them, in their thinking, to make a step into action is if they operate in a social environment where this group of people has then been demonized. And so this is what I had looked into, how the word, sometimes in some languages, the word Jews is used as an insult. We see that in France, so in French, and in German, and also in some parts in some English-speaking countries. In the UK, there was some incidents there. So that was then also used in some schools, using the word Jews as an insult. And that means that only works if everybody agrees that anything attached to Jews is something negative. So there's a norm established then that anything Jewish is negative. Only then this word works as an insult. And from that, it's only a small step then to take action against actual Jews. So this kind of establishing an anti-Semitic norm, social media helps a lot, unfortunately, in that. And it can be a small bubble, but if there's a confirmation in these social circles that this is right, this is the norm, then the step is much smaller to act on this. You can act on this online, by the way, as well. So online action has often very negative consequences as well. So we should not forget that more and more people, part of our lives is online and offline. And the distinction is not really useful very often.
So, there's am I on? Am I on? No, I'm on. Hello. There's a group in England called the Hate Project Lab, and they studied they accumulated data for 8 months on hate tweets, and then and focused on London, and then they asked police for their records on criminal behavior to try to see if there was any correlation, and they found an absolute correlation between the numbers of hate tweets in a particular part of London and the number of racially, religiously, ethnically motivated hate crimes. So the argument was it's a clear connection between the two. I agree with you. I think oftentimes it's a little more complicated. Maybe social media has made it less complicated. I'm not quite sure, but you know, we can give so many examples that aren't even necessarily focused on anti-Semitism, right? So President Trump used the word invasion 2,000 times, and the next thing you know, invasion shows up over and over again in a manifesto of a shooter who killed more than 20 people at a Walmart, right? So it just seems to me that the speech offers both acknowledgement and justification of the way the person feels, and then it makes it easier for them to act upon it. I mean, I could give you a lot more examples, but.
It's unfortunate that there are
That's
a
right.
lot of examples. So I think this idea of social media, a lot of people do know how to interact with other people and recognize that there's a line that they're not supposed to cross, even if they're saying things. What social media seems to have allowed this to do is, because it's reaching so many more people, it really increases the chances that one of those people at least is going to take some kind of action. So if you have one person on a street corner saying something, they can only reach so many people with that speech. But if you're putting it on social media and it's going out to so many more people, it just seems to make these actions more potentially likely just because of the volume that it's achieving. And a good example, I think, is, for example, the recent attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband that was supposed to be on her, and the fact that it appears that the attacker was very deeply entrenched in conspiracy theories, including anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That's the kind of thing where he may not have previously, in a world without social media, how much of that would he really have encountered on a day-to-day basis? How hard would he have had to look to find that before something like social media. And there's always been ways to disseminate it, radio, for example, but it just was probably very easy for him to find this when he set out to look. And so it just seems to make this a lot more likely. But I think when we think about that connection between hate speech and then violent action, sometimes it feels like there's a step in the middle that makes it easier. So it's going from saying something to having something be a mindset, be the way that you live or the way that you're seeing the world, and then taking an action that might not be directly violent. But for example, a big problem we've had in Houston is flyers. And all of these horrible anti-Semitic flyers that have been left on people's driveways. There's an argument there that it's not directly violent, but it's clearly being directed against Jews. And so this seems like it might make it a little easier once they've taken these actions over and over again, particularly if they're not facing particular consequences for it. And even if it's being put in the news, if it's making them, they're getting attention for this, it seems like this can help encourage more extreme actions. And so you sort of take first actions that are not good, but are perhaps not as violent, and then leading into potentially more extreme actions.
Can I say something?
Yes, of course.
I don't know if yes, I am. I mean, I know that we're focusing on social media, but I just kept thinking while both of you were talking, I mean, Father Coughlin had over 30 million listeners on the outset of World War II. And even though you can't communicate in the same way on radio, it's not back and forth like it is on social media. I mean, you know, his circumference was huge in that regard. And then, you know, about the same time, the Christian Front, as it was called, and a couple of other groups like America First began disseminating anti-Semitic flyers through government mail. Like they figured out a way to not only make copies of the flyers, but then to mail them through the government with taxpayer money. And that reached millions of American households. And it sat on the kitchen table maybe, you know, a few may have thrown it away right away, but it also may have been that as it sat there, you know, it has that power to sort of pull you in. So I know we're focusing on social media, but it just seems to me it happens in all sorts of other ways. I think local and state leaders are really important. I think about the Great Migration of 6 million Blacks out of the South and the unbelievably violent Northern backlash to that. It's no surprise to me that some of the most violently anti-Black communities are those destination communities of the Great Migration because they were never called down for it, right? They didn't have federal supervision like they did in southern cities. So I just think it's so much more complicated than getting YouTube to like do something or getting like Twitter to do something, because I think it comes down to all of us and our local communities as to how this stuff spreads and if we allow it to spread.
Thank you so much, Professor Gunther. I was just about to say that social media is the boogeyman, but then I backed off, right? Because we know better that there are other forms of media, other examples, and political context, and history, and migration, and a lot. You know that anti-Semitism is clearly part of a larger pattern of hatred. Again, I think we're going to circle back to some of these in the line of questioning. So the next question might pivot slightly towards. Well, we know, what do we do now? So let's try this. UNESCO identifies education as the most important tool to fight anti-Semitism. This is at least in my reading. According to your expertise, what remedies have been effective in the past and what might be effective in the future? So besides education, which I think is central, and maybe we can speak about that, are there, what about policymaking, law enforcement, or maybe is there like social media action? I mean, certainly people get banned from social media, but again, what are things that have worked in the past and might work in the future? So maybe Director Frake, if you'd like to start.
Well, this is a hard question for me because I spend most of my time thinking about the time when all the remedies failed. So one of the things that, when you look at it, democracy is really important here. So if we can work to protect our democracy and the way that we're all interacting with one another. We know that anti-Semitism can often be a canary in the coal mine when we're thinking about problems with the democracy, and we know that when there are problems with the democracy, it can make anti-Semitism more of an issue. So protecting democracy and thinking about how we're all interacting with each other in our society, which is a huge task, and that may not be particularly helpful. But on a more individual level, if we make hate speech, or particularly anti-Semitism, unacceptable in our specific circle. And to give you an example, at a previous job before I was at the museum, I had a colleague at lunch make a joke, and I don't remember the exact text of the joke, but it had something to do with Jews and making lots of money. And at the time I was a volunteer at the museum, he was well aware of that, and I got very upset. And he later came and apologized to me. Now, I don't think that I changed his mind. I'm sure that he said other things in other contexts, but he never made an anti-Semitic comment in my presence again. And I think he did it not because, and I did try to talk to him, and I think that personal connection is so important in talking to individual people, but I think it's because he saw that it had an impact on me, and he knew me. He knew that this was upsetting to me. So if we can all do this in our specific social circle, if we make it unacceptable among the people that we interact with, no, it doesn't magically make it go away, it never does, but the more that you can get it to go underground, the more that you can say, this is not something that we can just do and get away with. But I think it's also very important to not demonize people when they do this. So it's helpful to do this with people we actually know. I'm not advocating yelling at people on Twitter for anti-Semitism. That doesn't seem to work very effectively a lot of the time. It really helps when you have a previous connection with someone. But also, if you call someone, well, you're an anti-Semite, it's basically calling someone a Nazi. And what it seems like is when we demonize people for this, we push them deeper into circles that will say, no, you're wonderful, we agree with you, and they'll almost encourage this and help it become more extreme. So it's worth reaching out even to people who say things that are horrible and that we disagree with, so that they don't go deeper into those circles and that we're still willing to interact with them and talk to them. I think that that's really important. Because when basically it's, okay, you said something that was horrible, we're going to cancel you and no one's ever going to speak to you again. Well, there are going to be people who are going to speak to them again, and those are exactly the people that we don't want to be reinforcing these beliefs. So the importance of human connection, of seeing each other as actual human beings, being willing to have a conversation when people are being willing to have a conversation back, these to me seem really important. And you did take my answer about education. I'm an educator. I think that's the most important. But obviously we don't have the solution, or things would be better.
I'll let you go first.
Thank you. I think there are two approaches that have proven to be effective. So one is making clear that certain things are not acceptable in society, and then not broad condemnation of anti-Semitism or hate speech in general or something, but very directly specific things that have been said or action that have been taken, and not do this only along party lines that I have seen. So it took I think Republicans a long time, or longer than others, in the Kanye West incident to condemn this anti-Semitism, but in other cases it took Democrats a very long time to clearly condemn anti-Semitism when it came from progressives. So that's a certain thing that gives signals, of course, to the wider society. If there must be clear condemnation, not acceptance. And then there's education, pedagogy that works differently. I've talked to hundreds of people who have voiced anti-Semitic ideas in interviews. I've done hundreds of interviews with people who have said anti-Semitic things. I wasn't in an educational project with them, but my observations are that there are very few who are sure about their anti-Semitic worldview. They go back and forth and they try things out. And I think this is what you observe in jokes when you see a lot of people, young people, but also not so young people, try things out and make jokes to see how far they can go and if it's acceptable or not. And that's not a new thing anyway. So in that case, then we see, yes, they should be calling out, and you're right, establishing a personal connection and then talking about this is definitely helpful. But I think we should have both approaches. So one is a clear condemnation, saying this is not acceptable in the public sphere, and then of course calling out it on a personal level.
I wish I had written this, but I didn't. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. And so we need to make sure that we do speak and we are good allies and that we do act against hate speech and anti-Semitism. But, it's also clear to me that there are certain groups that are learning to deflect and say, oh no, they're not really anti-Semitic at all. So I listened to a recent recording of, I think he's the candidate for Attorney General maybe in Pennsylvania, I'm not quite sure. And he's been virulently anti-Semitic in his speeches, I mean virulently so. And somebody actually called him out on it, I think it was a reporter, and his wife pops in to say, oh no, we love Israel more than most American Jews do, right? As if to say, because we have pro-Israeli policy, somehow we're not anti-Semitic. So they're just conflating in an effort to deflect that he has been saying incredibly virulent anti-Semitic comments. So my point is that oftentimes it's not just that sort of top line that we hear, it's also all the stuff that sort of is attached to it. So I agree, education's important, information's important, but I also think we have to be really good allies. And the only way to do that is to be really informed. And so when we have schools that don't allow us to teach tough topics or to assign books like Mouse anymore, or that we grow in a state that we are the state with the most banned books right now of any other state, we should be appalled. And we should be writing our senators and representatives and, using phone banks to overwhelm their phone lines with how appalled we are.
We should vote.
I'm sorry?
We should vote.
Yes, well, that too. Absolutely. But you should know who you're voting for, right? So I guess my point is that it's so many different levels that, I teach college, you teach K through 12. And I'm always surprised. I teach in the honors college, so I'm getting the best. And you'd be surprised at how little they've learned in their history classes. So it's not that those teachers aren't maybe doing a good job, they may be restricted from doing a better job or restricted from what information they can convey or the books they can assign. And we're even starting to feel that at the college level. So, join the school board for heaven's sakes instead of voting for people you don't even know who they are. Right? So we're doing a big write-in campaign. Last year, we wrote over 1,500 letters to our senators and representatives in the Honors College. And this year, we're hoping to beat that, to literally overwhelm their offices with letters that say, because I am of voting age, I am concerned about, so that our elected officials will start paying attention, not just to donors, but to the people who actually vote them in or vote them out of office. And I think a lot of our young people feel a great lack of hope as far as if they can make a difference. And so I would also urge everybody to get involved in in our local community, but also in our local politics in ways that might prove to be, remarkably galvanizing to young people here.
May I jump in here just for a second? I think that is very true, and we should also not forget that we need to empower people with knowledge about the stereotypes and the tropes and how this manifests on social media, and that's a big task, I think, for schools and but not only schools in general, to that we get people to act responsibly on social media and to know what's out there and to recognize certain kind of mechanisms and tropes. It's what we're doing this the second time. We do the datathon and hackathon on social media and hate speech this January, and then we look at certain tropes about certain groups of people, but it's not so easy to recognize that. We've seen that over and over again.
I would follow up here with a question about Holocaust education and the education about anti-Semitism in the state of Texas. We have now a law mandating education about the Holocaust, and yet restrictions on some of the most effective teaching tools like maps.
I can tell you that most of them don't get much Holocaust history at all. In fact, for a while when I taught my 20th century genocide class, where we start with the Congo and we end with Bosnia and all of that, I for a while did not include the Holocaust because I assumed they had had a course or a class at least on the Holocaust. Well, it turned out they did not. In fact, they knew very, very little. They didn't know that the United States had refused Jewish refugees here. They didn't know that the camp finally opened in 1945 and the 900 and plus refugees who were allowed to come had to in fact sign a piece of paper saying that they would need to leave in a year, which Truman then waived. But the point is, they don't really learn very much about it at all. So I, of course, immediately put the Holocaust back into the course and realized that in that part of the course, I have to start at the very beginning. Like, they don't know what eugenics is. They don't know what, white supremacy is. They don't know what racialized science is. Like, they really don't have any background to any of it. So I can't blame them. And then when I talk to the teachers, because I'm also asked sometimes to give an assembly for, high schoolers or junior high, I learn how restricted they are and what they can and can't do. Some of that is that we're trying to do as much as we can in a short school year. We know that from U of H. They've shaved 2 weeks off of this semester since I started here, 13 years ago, I guess it is. So it's very clear that we're supposed to somehow cover the same material in less and less and less time. And now there's, of course, all these tests that take place. They also take days away from teaching. So some of it is that, but it's also the fact that I think we've politicized things that should not be politicized. We should not politicize hate speech. Anti-Semitism should not be a political issue. It should not have politics attached to it at all. But it's very clear based on school board recommendations and what the governor is saying and what the lieutenant governor is saying, the books they're banning and things, that in fact it's become political to teach kids about hate and how to overcome it.
Just a quick note, thank you so much. This we'll come to you, Director Frake. We want to make sure that we hold the microphone from the center, just in case for feedback. And I wanted to also add, thank you so much for this is a wide menu of options and awareness. I'm also mindful of the time, so maybe Director Frake, if you have something, you can go quickly.
I just real quick wanted to address, so the difference between the idea that there is a state mandate versus what actually happens in the classroom. So there is Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week, where all schools in Texas are supposed to do something about the Holocaust. There are a couple of glaring issues with that. One is there's absolutely no support. There's no idea of what that needs to look like. I can tell you a lot of teachers haven't even heard of that because we've created resources and asked, and a lot of people haven't heard. But basically that does not matter to teachers. What matters are the TEKS, the education standards. Those are created by the state. And the Holocaust is usually one line if it's there at all. In certain classes, it's not. In things like US history, it's one line. And so if we really actually want this to be taught, things like Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week, a supposed mandate, that actually doesn't really make a difference. What makes a difference is putting it in the standards that are tested, because if it's not tested, it is not taught. And I have a lot of teachers I had a teacher who told me that, well, I am teaching things that go directly against the new law, so when they went to their administrator, what am I supposed to do? And they said, well, teach it at the very end of the semester. And they ran out of time and they didn't teach it. So if we really want this, mandates look good, and I think that it's the kind of thing where politicians can say, look what we did. But that kind of mandate doesn't make a difference at all. If it's in the standards, then it's taught. If it's in the standards a lot, it will be taught more. If it's very almost not present in the standards, it won't be taught at all.
Briefly, can I just, as we approach the end, I would like to invite Professor Sanders to ask one more question, and at the same time, Anusha, if you can go around and start collecting questions. We can also start collecting questions over Zoom, so that can happen all simultaneously. Mr. Sanders.
I think I'll jump down here to one of the questions that we developed. What role has Christian nationalism and political races played in fueling anti-Semitic hate speech? And perhaps we might even say anti-Semitic hate crimes. I think we should talk about both speech and acts.
Can you repeat it?
Yes, what role has Christian nationalism and the current political races played in fueling anti-Semitic hate speech? We've touched a little bit on the political races and the normalizing of anti-Semitic tropes. We know that Professor Jikeli has written about religion, in particular, religious anti-Semitism. So perhaps you might share a little bit of your thoughts and your expertise on that question with us. And perhaps we can start with Professor Jikeli.
Thank you. Yeah, I will be very brief. Christianity has brought a rich reservoir, if you want, of anti-Semitic tropes, and very powerful ones. The churches have gone through some reform in the 1960s, starting with the Catholic Church, but also Lutheran churches, Protestant churches have, to some extent at least, dealt with the history of anti-Semitism from church officials, including Martin Luther, who wrote vicious anti-Semitic pamphlets. I would say even those who believe that anti-Semitism is not a good thing, the tropes are so powerful, also in secularized forms, that they pop up again and again. So it's only if you deal with that, if you have knowledge about them, that you can really recognize them and then not repeat them. So a lot of these things are now part of our culture, starting from this demonization of Jews and thinking that they're all powerful, or this supersessionism, thinking that Judaism is something that has no right to exist anymore because now Christianity is the new truth. So all these kind of tropes are still there in a lot of variations. And now with the extremist white nationalists, there's a split there. Some are atheists and some are Christian. And so it's a narrative. Some refer to Christian narrative and say, well, we are Christian white nation, and others say are more of a pagan tradition. But the reservoir is still is rich across the board, and it can be utilized by anti-Semites again and again very easily, because this is, yes, the churches often in the higher up hierarchies, they have dealt with that to some extent, but it hasn't triggered down to the even the early church fathers who went into polemics as Chrysostom. This is fragments of that are still used. So this is not known, and then we have a recent development of some churches who use the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to renew old Christian anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews.
Next.
What I can do is I can give you an example of what this looks like on a micro level. So just kind of maybe give you one specific example. So I was at an elementary school working with a group of fourth graders, and usually we try not to talk too much about the Holocaust with fourth graders, but the teachers wanted to do it, so I went in to try to do it as potentially gently as possible. So in a previous class period, I'd had a little girl who raised her hand and said that she was Jewish, and we talked a little bit about that with the class. But the period after, I did the whole presentation, we talked about the bad things that the Nazis did, how it started with words, all of these things. And at the very end of the presentation, a little boy who's a fourth grader raised his hand, and when I called on him, he said, "I don't like Jews." And I was worried I hadn't heard him right at first, and I needed a moment, but so I asked, "Well, can you tell me why not?" And he said, "Well, because they're not Christian." And so this little boy didn't come up with this by himself. This is a little boy who's been failed by the adults in his life. So that we've got kind of what it looks like on a micro level. That is how it manifests on an individual level. Is you have a fourth grader in a school with a Jewish classmate saying, "I don't like Jews because they're not Christian."
Well, that's loaded.
Yeah.
Really loaded. I personally think that a lot of more modern Christian nationalism is deeply tied with racial superiority theories, and it's almost impossible sometimes, at least for me, to disentangle one from the other, because they may call themselves Christian nationalists, but it's clear what they're espousing is oftentimes a sort of pseudo-scientific race-based white superiority. So at least for me, it's very difficult to disentangle one from the other. I was listening to the former General Michael Flynn, who is posing as a Christian nationalist leading a new movement, and some of what he said was so grossly anti-Semitic, I mean, my jaw just dropped. But I would bet that if I asked him, he would say, no, he was promoting white Christianity, which, as I said, seems to be really closely tangled up with anti-Semitism, right? It's almost like I can't tell the two apart very much anymore. So that older religious anti-Judaism, I guess you could call it, as it morphed into this sort of race-based anti-Semitism, it seems like it's the same emperor with new clothes, but it draws, as he was saying, from both religion as well as these sort of newer tropes of being politically unreliable, nationally unreliable, socially unreliable, and so on. But we're hearing more and more of it, and it's not being called out. And I am not sure. I mean, if you have, for example, a pastor in Houston who clearly is espousing anti-Semitic comments from the pulpit, you know, it's very difficult to get that congregation to understand that that's what's happening, unless you can get them one-on-one, which seems to me impossible to do. It seems to me it almost needs to be called out by local leaders.
Okay, thank you so much. May I take the next question? Okay, so we have some great questions coming from the live audience. I also want to invite our virtual audience. They can enter questions into the Q&A box. Okay, I see one question coming in, which I'll check in a little bit. So the question that I'm about to ask now, I'm going to marry it with one of my own questions that I had here on my list. And I begin by, there's a lot of research and discussion about anti-Semitism and hate speech and the things that we're discussing today. And by way of example, Jeremy Waldron has a book called The Harm in Hate Speech. And Nadine Strawson has a book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And you have in these two perspectives the idea of, okay, well, you have hate speech. People say hateful things against Jews, Muslims, Asians, etc. And one solution is to, physically stop it, ban it. And the other one is, no, let them speak in this free society of ours and counter it with even more speech. So I had a question about that, is hate speech merely a form of free speech, and what's the cost of suppressing or allowing it? And the question coming from the audience member relates to this, stating, do you believe that the U.S. constitutional amendment, that a U.S. constitutional amendment banning, quote, blood guilty, unquote, hate communication could make a difference? So if you could speak a little bit about legislation and maybe react to some of these, the questions in their different forms. Anyone can start, really.
I just know that for a while there was some Supreme Court decisions that seemed to support the notion of laws against group libel, for example, but those have slowly been chipped away and overturned. And so you're right, the debate seems to be now free speech with more free speech, that's the only way really to counter it is with more free speech. But again, I think that's where being informed is really important, because if it's so easy to say, anti-Semitic hate speech, for example, and for that then to quickly devolve into something that could be quite violent, you'd almost have to make sure that your citizenry is informed. I would also suggest that if you try to stop people from saying what they want to say, that devolves very quickly into them saying even more, but just going a little bit underground to say it. I mean, we saw that during the Obama presidency, right? It went from there being this sort of invisible line between what you could or couldn't say about a president to just a free-for-all of tropes, racist comments, hate speech, and attempts at violence at our first Black president. Could we legislate against that? I'm not so sure that we can. I think we need to hold each other more accountable.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I come from a country where they're not called hate speech laws, but there is, for example, you cannot, in Germany, you cannot praise Nazism. That is a crime. But that doesn't mean that neo-Nazis don't praise Nazism. They do so, but in forms that are just under the threshold of a crime, but the audience understands that perfectly well. So the effectiveness of laws, well, we have to evaluate that. What is effective and what's not effective. But what we see now on social media is it's things that are controversial that get promoted and then they get a bigger platform. So this, of course, that we need to think about measures, how to reduce that. And also, of course, things that incite to violence, more or less directly, we need to think about measures, how to reduce it or even take it off the platforms. There has been a slow development in the last four years or so, but of course the platforms can, if they wanted to do, they could do much more. But this is an international debate we have to have. So some of these platforms, many of these platforms are owned by US companies, but others are owned by Chinese companies or other countries, and they have, for Russian companies, they have other standards. So they take off a lot of things, but this is when the government is criticized, right? So this is an international context, so we have to take this into account when we discuss these kind of measures that we would like to see. But it's a huge debate, I think, that we have to hold as a society, because as I said, I mean, a lot of people live part of their life on social media or with social media. So it's a kind of public place in some ways. And this is new, so it's not so private. These are private companies and they can make up their own rules. But when it gets into in a more public place where social interaction takes place, well, we have to see how we as a society want to deal with that.
I think I understood. I'm German too. I was born there, lived there for quite a while. And when I was there last summer, I heard some Germans speaking about an EU commission that was debating whether it would be possible to make their social media platforms accountable for the same laws that publishers are, which means then you could sue the platform for publishing malicious content, right? Just like you could a publishing house. Do you have any idea if that's gone anywhere?
Yes, so it's law now in Germany, and I think on the EU level there have been some attempts to do similar things. So if somebody sees something that is falls under hate crime in speech, so some of these, like for example praising Nazism in like showing the swastika and disseminating that, right? And if somebody signals that to the platform, and the platform doesn't take it.
Come on.
Down within 24 hours. So but this is then only if somebody sees it and calls us out.
Okay, very good. I'm also mindful of the time. I'm sorry, I'm the timekeeper. Nobody likes a timekeeper. So I'll ask one more question. I'm going to urge our esteemed colleagues to try and answer quickly. We might be able to do another question, or this might be the last one. So let's go for it. I'm going to also try and combine two questions, which are quite hot button questions, and look forward to your answers. So one question, of course, is in reference to earlier points where there was some discussion of conservative politicians and candidates perpetuating anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric to appeal to their voter bases. What can be done about this? And I want to combine this with another question talking about how Jews vote in the United States. One of the questioners saying that they tend to vote Democratic, whereas the Republican Party tends to be more pro-Israel. I know that you mentioned, actually, Professor Gunther, earlier, that you can be sort of, that's not necessarily...
Maybe not one and the other,
So,
right.
and again, any reactions are welcome within a minute.
Go for it, Amy.
Okay, so you had me the hot potato. All right. I mean, I think the problem is that this is incredibly difficult to answer very quickly, but I think that there has to be a recognition that this is a problem amongst multiple political parties and different sides of the political spectrum. It may look different, but it is there everywhere. And this idea that, well, the Democratic Party is slow to call it out when it's their people, and the Republican Party is slow to call it out when it's their people, this is a consistent problem. And I'm afraid I don't have a solution to that. But I do think that if we see it from people that we see as our own, calling it out is even more important than calling it out when it's someone that we may see as not our own. Because we have to show that this person is someone that we may see as very close to us. In that case, it should be incredibly horrible that we're hearing this from someone that we say that we respect, someone that's one of our own. And I think the only way to really work with this is to call out the people who are on our, I guess, quote unquote, side, for lack of a better term here. And if we can all agree to do that, it becomes less of a political issue. Because right now, you have the Republicans who can call it out on one side and the Democrats who can call it out on the other. We need to call it out on our own side. I'm not sure how to make people do that. If anyone has any ideas, please let us know.
I mean, I think that's something you learn from the time you're in elementary school, or we should be teaching it, right? We were talking before everybody got here about the circle of obligation, and that we teach our kids from the time they're very little that their circle of obligation gets bigger. At first it's their parents and their siblings, and then it becomes their neighbors, and then it becomes, the block on which they live and so on. But we have a tendency not to do that. We have a tendency to talk about individual rights and individual freedoms without understanding how those can come, full stop into problems like hate speech. And the tendency then is to sort of duck and say, well, it's not affecting me, so I'm not going to say anything. But in fact, it does affect all of us. If we allow one group or even one individual to be the target of hate, it's quite likely that the target grows.
Yeah, I mean, we live since the horrors of the Holocaust have become visible, I think, to everybody. And even if there's a lot of lack of knowledge among many, many people, there's the rough idea that really something really bad happened, right, to Jews in Europe. That is, I think, shared knowledge. So today, very few people want to be anti-Semites, but they still have this kind of conspiratorial way of thinking and anti-Semitic sentiments. So what can they do with their sentiments and their feelings? They have to voice it in a way that makes sense to themselves and their audiences, and that they can get away with that. So that's why it's just dressed up differently from wherever you come from. So it has to be called out, whatever the background is. And just to be clear, if somebody uses Israel to demonize Jews, well, this is anti-Semitic. And what a lot of people don't understand, that Israel is a big part for most Jews of their identity, right? Even if they don't live, I have not lived in Israel, but if you have suspicion against anybody Jewish, that they might be supporting and demonize an evil state, well, then this is anti-Semitic. So we have to be clear on this. And it doesn't matter who says something that goes along these lines. And sometimes it depends on the context, if that's then really anti-Semitic or somebody just repeated something. And my evaluation of that is usually if somebody says something anti-Semitic, right, that person doesn't need to be an anti-Semite. But it can become very clear if this person then gets called out, and if this person doubles down, then there's a clear sign that this is an anti-Semitic way of thinking. But the person should also get the opportunity to say, well, I said something wrong, I thought about this, I apologize, and I think this is wrong, and I will think about it, why did I do this, and why I had these thoughts. So yeah, it's not clear cut, but it doesn't, it shouldn't matter from which political party people say something anti-Semitic. It should be called out anyway.
Okay, of course we're out of time, and I'm going to transform a couple of questions into a comment, and with Professor Sanders' permission and our colleagues, we'll segue into the end. So of course we do have great questions here about how to maximize, use of personal connections based on the feedback coming from the panel, talking about the solution being more empathy and value for individual lives. I'm hoping that we can take this discussion into the reception and discuss further over there. If I had another 3 hours, I would pull out my FBI statistics right now on hate crimes, right? I would talk about the intersectional fight that anti-Semitism offers us, an intersectional fight for justice. And on that note, I will just end by, I would thank, of course, our panel one last time. I thank my co-moderator. I would thank you, the audience. I would also like to thank, of course, our sponsors. And quickly, I would like to thank also the staff that made this possible: Anushe Siddiqui, Nana Kanadu, Hector La Rota, Genesis Steakhouse, and again, all of you Please join me one last time in thanking our panel.